Day 147 to 9:10 p.m., North Langanoy Gulf, Bicol Region, Catanduanes. Barak was delighted to receive permission to help. He immediately commanded his Thunderbird, Trua, to cast down a rain of lightning towards the horde. Like what Mark suggested, Barak concentrated the lightning attacks at the armor type, infected. Of course, not all his attacks hit the intended targets directly. Lightning magic was hard to control, even for creatures that were capable of using it by instinct. Nonetheless, the missing attacks still did damage because the infected that rose from the sea were all soaking wet. The lightning attacks were extremely successful in felling the armored infected. It was unlike the bullets from the guns held by the soldiers atop the wall. The defense line of the infected crumbled slowly. The other infected that did not have armor faced a barrage of bullets. Just with Barak's slight intervention, the situation at the port eased extremely. As this was supposed to be his fault, helping this way made Barak feel lighter in his heart. Still, he was not satisfied until the threat were all eliminated. Thus, he commanded Trua to continue attacking the infected below. While circling in the sky, raining pillars of lightning towards the infected below, Barak was off for a surprise. "What the FCK?" Barak cried out as he saw Mark and May flying towards him and Trua. "You two can freaking fly?" Barak asked out loud as Mark and May arrived before him. Mark turned to May first before replying, "We can, so?" Barak was speechless. For some reason, he felt frustrated. In any case, now was not the time to talk about this kind of thing. Mark had the same thoughts and went to the point. "You continue helping the soldiers. We're going to lure out the leader." The two then left without letting Barak say anything else. Scratching his head, Barak took a last glance at Mark and May. He then commanded Trua to continue the attacks. It did not take a few seconds, however. Barak's full attention fell on Mark and May once more. There was no way he would not, as he felt a strong surge of magical energy coming from Mark. Barak noticed several crystals emitting bright glows while floating around Mark. He was sure that the surge of magical energy came from those crystals alone. But then, it started. Dark clouds started to cover the starry sky, swirling with Mark and May below its center. Being on the magical part of the current society, it was not the first time he saw something at this scale that was caused by magic. Even the tribulations of Chinese cultivators he saw before were far more eye-catching since some could happen in the middle of the city. Nonetheless, Barak never expected to see something like this to happen at this moment. Asterisk 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 Mark and May flew to a part of the gulf not too far from the shore. There, Mark stared at the water below before he called forth for the crystals. There was no way to fight the enemy that was staying underwater. They needed to lure it out. In any case, Mark had the best bait here, and thus, he activated the crystals. He was not only preparing to lure it out but also something else, just in case. And like what Mark wanted, the leader of the horde surfaced from the sea. Well, what Mark did not expect was for this monster to be this big. Mark and May could not help but fly upwards in a hurry as the water heavily splashed, accompanied by a loud, piercing roar. Unlike anything that they heard, however, it sounded like a choir of suffering souls. The leader type S body rose 30 meters from the water surface, and to say, it was likely that its size was far bigger, considering how a part of its body was still underwater. Not to mention, they were currently in the deep parts of the Gulf. As the water subsided, the appearance of the monster was revealed. What no one expected, however, was its appearance. It was a hellish amalgamation. Unlike other infected, even the giants from before, whose bodies grew bigger because of the mutation their bodies went through, this one was totally different. It had grown larger, not on its own. Its entire body was composed of hundreds to thousands of different bodies fused together, wobbling unsteadily. While the part of its body that came out of the water appeared to be shaped like the head of an octopus, its true visage was rather hard to describe. It was a gigantic body of bodies. And that piercing roar? It came from hundreds to thousands of mouths on its body that cried out together. It was not wrong to say that this whole infected could be considered as a horde that was bound by flesh matter, There was no limit as to what creature formed its body. There were animals and fishes. There were even some infected birds in it. The creature wobbled up and down until it managed to shoot a part of its body. It was like a tentacle that whipped towards Mark as its target. Mark and May hurriedly flew out of the way. The tentacle, composed of bodies stuck arm and toe, roaring in pain and fury, missed, whipping back towards the enemy. It hit its own body. Many of the bodies were crushed to an unrecognizable degree, and the pain made all of it roar ear-piercingly. Nonetheless, it was not damaged overall, only that tentacle and the part it hit. But then, like shedding its skin, the damaged bodies popped off the main fused body, falling onto the sea and dyeing it red with both flesh and blood. Mayor, ready the crystal converter, this guy seems to be a tricky one. Mark said, with a frown. There was no way he would expect this. He could only sense a faint consciousness in this monster, similar to those with small bodies. But as it appeared, its mutation might have been something that enabled it to construct its body using different kinds of flesh-living matter. After shedding off the damaged bodies, the leader type attacked once more. It was surely an intelligent one. When Mark managed to evade its first attack, and it hit itself instead, it attacked differently. Wobbling unsteadily a few times, it shot several tentacles. It increased in number, and instead of whipping violently, it switched into trying to constrain Mark and May. The movements of the tentacles also became faster. It was at the expense of the painful roars of the bodies used to form those tentacles. Mark could not help but observe the bodies. As it appeared, not only that they were bound by a flesh-like matter, their bodies seemed to be under the control of the leader type. While it was trying to constrain Mark and May, the arms of the bodies would stick off the flesh matter while trying to reach their target. On the other hand, the heads were moaning and roaring differently. It was as if they were struggling to break free. With a flap of his wings, Mark finally counterattacked. He charged forwards, not even evading the tentacles. The hands of the bodies of the tentacles tried to reach Mark, but like a ghost, his body blurred, making all those hands touch nothing but thin air. It seemed that the leader type flinched at the sudden unexpected event. The tentacles were retracted, trying to chase after Mark. Aside from that, the leader type detached more bodies from its huge body, forming more tentacles, trying to pincer Mark, front and back. But then, at the last moment, Mark vanished into a puff of black mist. Instead, the converged tentacles were rained bullets from May's sniper rifle. Each shot of May's sniper that was imbued with magical power could make a punch-size hole even in an inch-thick iron plate. And with her eyes, zooming and slowing her sight, she could accurately shoot the tentacles in the same area. With that rain of magic-imbued bullets, several tentacles were severed. As Mark had thought, when the tentacles were detached from the main body, although still stuck together, the living bodies of the infected gained the freedom to move their arms on their own. Unfortunately for them, being stuck together that way, there was nothing else that would happen to them aside from sinking under the sea. While May started severing the tentacles, Mark circled the huge octopus head-shaped body. What he wanted to do was to find at least a small gap on the body to slip into. As long as there was even a tiny space, his black mist movement would allow him to slip through. He needed to keep the brain of the leader type intact. However, its real body was deep inside the gigantic fused one. Unfortunately, Mark could not see any gap in its body that was above the water. Maybe there was somewhere underwater. But Mark did not want to try that. There were various risks in doing that, after all. Mark then drew Ignis from his back, slashing the body violently. The strong wide swing from Mark hacked through several bodies and opened a deep wound among the disgustingly fused bodies. Unfortunately, the whole thing was not hollow at all. Inside the wound were the same as the surface, filled with wailing bodies of infected, trying to reach Mark with their blood-covered arms. Tisk! Mark suddenly clicked his tongue and retreated without hesitation. The infected just shot a huge clump of its fleshy membrane, trying to swallow Mark into its body like a net. It seems like trying to enter its body also came with risks. Mark grumbled. The leader type could clearly control its whole body, changing its shape at will. And there, the huge wound that Mark opened was patched instantly, shedding the bodies that Mark severed. Well, at least some of them, but not all. But at that scene, Mark noticed something. So, that's how it is, huh? Mark murmured. Like when this monster hit itself with its own tentacle, it shed those smashed bodies into the sea. But not every single damaged body, but only those with specific injuries. As such, Mark decided to try it once more. Wielding Ignis, Mark slashed several bodies horizontally and retreated as several clumps of flesh membrane tried to capture him. Mark did not kill the infected bodies. They were eaters, after all. Even if their bodies were fatally injured, they would still move as long as their brain was intact. Even so, Mark made sure to leave a specific injury with that slash. And as he expected, the leader type shed those bodies off. Looks like I'm right. It can't accept those with damaged spinal columns into its body. Mark deduced as he started to devise a plan. He needed to force the real body out of this hellish amalgamation. It was an intelligent infected and would surely give him a crystal to obtain. It was at this point that Mark noticed Barack on his Thunderbird approaching. "What are you doing here?" Mark asked. After all, Barack was supposed to be supporting the soldiers at the shore. But then, Mark noticed that the gunshots and explosions had died down. He did not realize until now, since his attention was fully concentrated on the leader type. "Sir," Barack replied. All the infected attacking the settlement had withdrawn. Both the port and the west side. Of course, with the battle there ending prematurely, there was nothing Barack could do but to approach Mark and May to join the fray. But then, Mark was confused. Although the infected were attracted to magical energy, they would not turn around when they basically had prey in front of them. In this case, it was the soldiers and the settlement that was the prey. So, why were they withdrawing? And here, Mark's eyes fell on the leader type. "Darn, it's you, isn't it?" Day 147 to 9:11 p.m. Port area, Catanduanes Settlement, Codon, San Andres, Catanduanes. Along the walls overseeing the port area, the soldiers watched the spectacle happening at the Gulf. The infected mysteriously retreated. The only thing the soldiers could do now was to observe the battle between two people and a gigantic monster. Of course, they could try and shoot the infected that were still in sight before they re-enter the waters. However, the general already ordered to cease firing. If the infected were retreating, let them be, and the settlement should not incur unnecessary aggression from them. Still, it was imperative that no one should let their guards down. In this kind of situation, no one knew what could happen. That was why everyone that could had to pay attention to the battle above the sea. And to say, everyone had very complex emotions at this scene. Fear. What if that gigantic abomination came and attacked the settlement? Would the walls even hold for a second? No, it would instantly fall, without a doubt. There was not even a chance to think about it. There was no need to think about resisting. Even if they deployed all of their explosives and blew everything up altogether, there was no assurance that they would win. Even if it did, there was no future to be seen for the settlement. Only explosives could damage highly mutated infected and a lot of evolved animals. Using up all their explosives would cause the settlement to face destruction sooner or later. But that was if the settlement itself managed to go unscathed by the intensity of explosion needed to eliminate that thing. Definitely not. There was no way that they would win or even have a good ending. However, despite the fear, there was also relief. Those in the know felt relieved that, whatever that abomination was, it was a leader type infected. If that gigantic amalgamation of bodies attacked the settlement directly, it would have fallen immediately. However, it did not and would not. Among the infected, there was a nature that was quite unique to leader types. It was, no matter what their abilities were or what size they had, leader type infected tend to stay either behind or at the center of their horde. This type of infected would not move and attack unless certain conditions were met. The first condition was if the leader type was under a stronger and more intelligent one. It could be another leader type, a parasitic type, a breeder type, or maybe the rumored monarch types. The second was when their horde was already wiped out or on the verge of collapse. Without other infected to command, the leader type would start attacking by itself. On the other hand, more intelligent leader types would likely flee when that happened. And the third condition they knew was if the leader type was forcibly dragged out of hiding. This condition could happen if leader type was identified and was attacked directly, incurring its rage in the process, or if it was lured out by any means possible. As it appeared to be, the third condition was fulfilled by Mark, luring the leader type out of hiding. None of the soldiers knew what he did, though. Another thing that made them feel relieved that it was Mark that lured it out and not them. Who knows what would happen if it was them that forced it to come ashore? Even Andrew, who was shouting to find the leader type earlier, could only stay silent after finally seeing what he wanted to kill. And despite the fear and relief, there was also amazement. The people were amazed as to how Mark and May could confront that frightening creature face to face. It did not matter that the two were capable of flight. It was because that alone would not give anyone the confidence or bravery to stand in front of that terrifying thing. Even if they were capable of flight, they were unsure whether they could muster the courage. There was no need to say just having two people. Even if there were dozens of them, they would not have the guts at all. There was no way they would try to face a being that was as tall as a building with their weak human bodies. And yet, Mark and May were there, circling around the body of that infected and cutting off its disgusting tentacles. And with that amazement, then came envy. If they could fly like Mark and May and had the courage to face such an abomination, maybe they would be the ones everyone was watching. Maybe they were the ones receiving everyone's admiration. And yet, here they were, standing atop the walls with shaking knees, wishing and praying that that creature would just vanish and leave this settlement alone. With meager abilities and very little courage, the only thing they could boast here was their cowardly will to survive. Back at the Gulf, Mark could only frown seeing how the infected returned to the sea. Of course, there was absolutely no way that they were retreating. They were called by this leader type for a single reason. And without a doubt, it was to forcefully enlarge its body further. Without a doubt, it realized that it would not be able to catch Mark at its current state. It might have thought that if it had a larger body, it would also become powerful. At the same time, it would replace the bodies that it discarded because of Mark's attacks. It was desperate to catch Mark to the extent that it widened the scope of its control, including the infected at the west side of the settlement. What a troublesome guy, Mark murmured. If it was like this, whittling away its body would take quite a while doing it manually. Whoosh! Whoosh! Several tentacles shot towards Mark's group, forcing everyone to get out of the way. And for sure, Mark was right. This leader type already started to absorb the horde underwater. The sudden increase in the length of the tentacles was totally noticeable. Unfortunately for this huge thing, however, it was lacking what it needed the most. It was speed. The larger its body became and the longer its tentacles grew, the more sluggish it moved. Even though its tentacles reached Mark's group above, it already lost a lot of its momentum. Well, it was only in Mark's perception, however. In fact, the tentacles just now were as fast as a raging truck. Regular people would have a hard time reacting to that, especially with how numerous those tentacles were. Mark did not care about that speed, however. He was more concerned about thinking of an easier way to get the real body out. "Sir, what do you plan to do with that thing?" Barack asked out loud. He could not move any closer to Mark because of the tentacles continuously swaying around them. His Thunderbird was way bigger than a human and was an easier target than Mark and May. Thus, he did not dare come too close. Mark turned to Barack. The summoner had nothing that he could do here aside from one thing. "How many of your pets can fly and attack at long range?" Mark asked back. "The ones I summoned this afternoon. That's all." Barack replied hurriedly. Then, summon them all and fly up. All you need to do is have your pets attack that thing as much as possible. Also get rid of the bodies of any infected you see, at least, destroy their spines. Barak could not understand what Mark was up to and why there were some specific orders, however, he could only nod. It was his fault as to why this humongous creature was here. Thus, he would do anything to help. And with that, Barak commanded Trua to fly higher. At the same time, he began to summon. Everyone that was watching was surprised as magic circles bloomed like small fireworks in the sky. Their shock grew even more as magical beasts appeared around the bird that shot lightning before. Except for the flying serpent named Baku, the other flying pets of Barak were here once more. With a few words from their summoner, the barrage of magic attacks towards the leader-type infected began. Bathed by harmful attacks, the choir of painful roars ensued. It was a wave of agonizing screams of pain, telling everyone what kind of torture they were suffering. Mark frowned at the irritating sound entering his ears. Each of the bodies that composed this gigantic amalgamation was connected by the leader type. Since the main part of the connection was the spine, it was likely to be a connection within the neural network of each body. It also allowed the leader type to control the bodies fully. However, it came with a cost. Even one body that felt extreme pain, every single body in this amalgamation would share it. The more its huge body was damaged, the more the bodies that composed it cried in pain. Mark could not help but notice those details as Barak continued attacking without pause. And there, Mark had an idea. If the leader type was this intelligent, then it was very likely that it was a mutated biter. A type of infected that had a body that was still functioning as a living human. It could definitely feel the same pain as the others had. In fact, Mark could sense its tiny consciousness slightly fluctuate at every heavy attack that its body received. It appeared that it had high pain tolerance, however. Then, all we have to do is inflict too much pain that it could not endure. Mark said, letting May hear his thoughts. With a nod at each other, Mark and May also prepared. Mayor, you can use up to 2 crystal converters, Mark spoke. But avoid the center of the octopus head-shaped part. That's where our guy is. May nodded once more at Mark's instructions. While Mark used himself as a distraction, May set up the crystal converter on her sniper rifle. And then, with a momentum that made everyone tremble, a huge beam of light, not any less bright than the sun, shot from May's sniper rifle. The gallery could not help but cover their eyes, turning their faces away from the battle. It was painful to their eyes that already adjusted to the darkness of the night. Nonetheless, a wave of ear-piercing cries forced their aching eyes to look back at the battle. And to say, their mouths were hanged open. The amalgamation started tossing around, causing large waves in the middle of the gulf. The movements of the monster were too strong that people watching on the walls that were about half a kilometer away from the battle felt droplets of water hitting their faces. That violent reaction turned the calm gulf into a stormy-looking one. Even so, everyone felt that its reaction was not exaggerated, considering that it had a dump truck-sized hole at the bottom center of its body. However, it was just starting. Thom. Another beam of light forced everyone's eyes away from the monster. May fired another crystal converter. Another wail of thousands of voices ensued. Those that heard it could not help but feel their hearts tighten. The voices of suffering and pain that were like it came from hell stirred up their conscience. Even Barak was severely affected, causing his summons to stop attacking. Mark, on the other hand, could only frown deeper. He stretched out his hands, activating wind manipulation mental crystal. Suddenly, it became quiet. The wails of pain vanished, and everyone snapped out of its uncanny effects. To think that this thing can do something like that. Gerger, is it a mental attack? But I'm wearing it. May asked as she was also affected a bit. It was strange considering that she was wearing half of the agimet that could block mental attacks. Sort of, Mark replied, not letting his eye leave the giant trashing the gulf below. It's not a magical one, though. That's why our agimet could not block it. It seems to use irregular sound waves like how music and sound effects can affect the mood of a scene in a drama. What a tricky creature. That was what Mark thought as he started at the amalgamation. Fortunately, he already found several weaknesses. The only thing left was to force the true body out. Day 147 to 9:15 p.m. Langoyon Gulf, Kodon, San Andres, Catanduanes. According to the weather prediction equipment installed in the military base of Catanduanes settlement, no rain, even a drizzle, could be expected to happen. Since the outbreak started, the weather had been calm around the world except for the first month and second. It was only because of the burning houses, crashed cars, and rotting corpses. It increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When that phase passed, however, the weather had been consistent despite the slight drop in temperature. Since the plants around the world received the same benefits from mutagen as humans, it started to fix the issue of global warming. And thus, while rain and storms could still happen, it was reduced by a whole lot. And yet, the situation at the Gulf was more than just a raging storm. Dark clouds swirled in the sky as if marking the end of the world. Waves raged violently enough to capsize medium-sized boats. And there was also a drizzle of red. What? Why is the water red? One soldier at the settlement walls noticed. It also had a heavy, unsettling smell. Hearing that soldier made others check the water that drizzled over them. And in horror, everyone immediately ran for cover. It was not just seawater that was splashing towards them. It was mixed with blood and even some small chunks of unidentifiable flesh. Without a doubt, these disgusting things came from that monster thrashing around at the Gulf. Although everyone was still confused about why the painful cries and roars suddenly vanished, it did not matter anymore. The first they needed to do right now was to seek shelter. The majority of the people left the open. However, as the soldiers could not vacate their posts for obvious reasons, they donned their raincoats instead. Even so, a lot of them wanted to leave. It was due to the surroundings starting to smell awful, along with the chunks of flesh that were a sight for sore eyes. They could only turn their eyes back to the ongoing scene. Who would think that even though the creature was quite far away, the settlement would still be affected? At the Gulf, Mark, May, and Barack, along with the summoned creatures, watched the amalgamation as it rampaged. It was like a gigantic earthworm salted alive. The only difference compared to earthworms was the size, and the worms could not emit a cry that could affect the emotions of those that heard it. The infected amalgamation continued to trash around. Its huge body already had two about 3-meter wide holes. One was below the center of its octopus head-shaped part above the water and the other even lower. Even though the wounds caused by the crystal converter were supposed to be burnt and melted, making it unable to bleed, its violent movements caused the burns to crack open, making it feel even more pain. It dyed the seawater red, and chunks of its flesh started to fall off. Nonetheless, despite the extreme pain it felt, it seemed that the leader type learned what it should do to ease the pain. Its huge tentacles shot off in erratic ways. Not towards its enemies above, however, but towards itself. It looked really disgusting. It was as if an octopus made of infected bodies started piercing itself with its own wiggling tentacles. And then, it started tearing off the burnt parts of its wounds. It was using the hundreds of hands of the tentacles brutally peeling off the ischar surrounding the hole. The thick burnt ischar on the hole stopped it from being able to heal itself and made the damaged bodies stuck in place. It was one of the things that caused the leader type severe pains since it was not able to automatically remove the damaged bodies. Now, it started tearing off its own flesh, causing more blood to spill and more unusable bodies to fall into the water. Tisk. Mark clicked his tongue as they saw the monster started healing. Without a doubt, although it was subjected to more pain, its actions were effective. Mayor. Mark's eyes turned serious as he called her. Use one more. That order made May look at Mark in askance. Sure? Of course, she would ask that. After they returned from America, Mark spent some time making a few crystal converters whenever they had free time at the base. As Mark had said before, making it was not easy. Since May already knew about it, Mark did not make it secretly anymore, and she was allowed to watch. May saw how many he made and how many were wasted. Among those hundreds of wooden plates, he only succeeded 5 times. That was right. May only had 5 crystal converters on hand, and they already used up 2. Aside from the crystal converters, the non-attribute mental crystals were also limited in number. She did not want valuable things that Mark owned to be wasted. "You don't think that it's worth it?" Mark asked as May seemed to be hesitating. And to that question, May nodded. "Don't worry," Mark said, approaching her and patting her head. "It might be a gamble, but I think it's totally worth it." Those words made May nod as she started to prepare the next shot. Mark, on the other hand, also prepared his next move. "It's been quite a while, I guess," he murmured as blood whips came out between his back and wings. The blood whips then immediately formed bladed spider-like limbs. Barak, to the side, watched the amazing spectacles that Mark and May displayed. Although he already continued to command his summons to attack, his eyes were still glued to the two. It could not be helped. It was because the more time he spent with Mark's group, the more their mysteriousness deepened. Just now, 2 of those things the two showed was enough to shock him. One was that shot that May's weapon did, and that metal blades that protruded from Mark's back. Questions in his mind began piling up since this afternoon after Mark dragged him into his group. THOOM. Without warning, the third beam of light shot from May, piercing another huge melted hole into the amalgamation's body. Of course, the leader type's thrashing had gotten worse. The waves it created started to become higher and higher. The worst part for the leader type was that the third shot doubled unto the first shot that May fired, burning all the tentacles crammed unto the hole into smithereens. Then, Mark made his move before the leader type could conjure more tentacles to fix the hole, and what he did was surprising to everyone watching. Flapping his wings with a red glow, Mark charged into the hole on the amalgamation's body. Sensing that there was an intruder inside the hole, the leader type trashed around even more. Unfortunately, it could not shake Mark out as his concentration was at a maximum at this moment. And there, Mark did the unexpected. And that was to dig into the enemy's huge body and force out the main one. That was why he prepared the metal limbs that he had not used since the encounter with Snow, turning him into a Spider King candidate. Using Ignis to open the first wound, blood scattered around and even on Mark's face and body. But he did not care as his arms moved faster and faster. But Mark did not stop there. He was not holding back anymore, not allowing the wounds to regenerate. Ignis started to burn with black flames. Even Mark started releasing black flames and lightning as he tore through the amalgamation's body. Although the black-colored energies could not be seen from afar, especially in the middle of the night, everyone could see how the amalgamation go berserk. It even started trashing its whole body underwater, intending to drown Mark, who was tearing into its body. Unfortunately for the leader type, that instinctual move had no effect on Mark, who was now enveloped with a sphere of wind. Furthermore, the wind that circled around Mark was accompanied by wind blades that helped to tear through the enemy's fleshy body. Along with the waves, the cries intensified, trying to stop Mark from his assault. However, it did not have any effect at all. Mark could sense that leader type was getting desperate. Covered in blood and guts, Mark already tore through half the distance from the hole and where the main body was. But then, the leader type did a move that it did not do before. And surely, this move would make it harder for Mark to reach the main body. Mark could only frown as he felt the consciousness of the leader type started to move differently from how its huge body moved. Tisk. Mark clicked his tongue. This guy can change locations. Like Mark had said, the main body started to swim inside its humongous constructed body. If it continued, it would not only take Mark more effort, but there might be a possibility that it could escape while Mark was still trapped inside. As if Mark would let that happen. He already wasted 3 crystal converters and 3 mental crystals to capture this guy. And as such, Mark fully activated the wind manipulation mental crystal. This move would definitely use up all its energy, rendering it unusable for some time. But Mark did not care this time. He wanted was to catch the leader type, or at least, get the head intact. Then, absorb its ability into a physical crystal. There was no way he would give up on a potentially useful ability. Mark stretched his hand forwards. A sphere of wind started to form in front of his palm. The wind in the sphere spun violently, even trying to rush out of Mark's control. Nevertheless, Mark started to gather more, causing the sphere to grow bigger and bigger. But then, Mark controlled its growth, making it smaller and smaller instead. He converged a huge amount of wind into the sphere while making it as small as he could. Mark's arm started shaking. Even in his state, his arm could not handle the pressure. With that, his arm started to glow bright red, returning into its steady posture. Finally, the wind manipulation mental crystal dimmed. The converging of wind slowly came to a halt as Mark left a little amount of energy just in case. And then, Mark released it. Let's call this Spiral Gale Bomb. He murmured. ********************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************* everyone's ears suddenly rang, causing everyone to flinch. And those that managed to endure, their eyes turned wide as the strong gust of wind assaulted their faces. More than half of the amalgamation's body exploded from within, turning the majority of its bodies and flesh to pieces. In the sky, even May and Barak's summons were pushed by the strong burst of wind. Aside from the top part of the amalgamation's body that was launched into the air and was left underwater, nothing else remained. And then, a red light shot from underwater towards the remaining part of the amalgamation that was launched up in the air. The light pierced through it, along with a spatter of flesh and blood. The red light was no other than Mark, looking like someone that jumped into a sea of barbed wires. His clothes were ripped here and there, even his hair turned ragged with uneven cuts. The worst part was his right arm. From his hand to his shoulder, the skin was ripped off, leaving his bare muscles exposed. But Mark did not care. His attention was focused on the flailing man he was holding with his left hand. It was a very thin-looking infected, too thin that the idiom's skin and bones literally described its appearance. Who would have thought that this thing was the main body of that huge amalgamation? The infected flailed for a bit. However, it could not get itself free from Mark's grasp on its neck. Thus, it tried to counterattack, trying to absorb Mark instead. But then, with a black flash of a metal limb, its body stopped moving. Its body then fell, leaving nothing but a decapitated head in Mark's grasp. Day 147 to 9:18 p.m. Langanoi Gulf, Kodon, San Andres, Catanduanes. The strong winds, the violent waves, the rain of blood and flesh, and the darkened swirling clouds, it was not that far-fetched to call it a storm. Pulled by gravity, the blasted remains of the infected got swallowed by the raging waters. The waters of the Gulf that was supposed to reflect the sky had lost that property. At this moment, the water was already murky red because of the blood from the infected. The color even began to spread out further away. In the sky, Mark stared at the head of the infected he was holding until it slowly died. Even as a severed head, it still managed to live longer than other infected. It was something to expect from a mutated infected capable of fusing infected bodies using a flesh membrane. It even tried to cover its bleeding neck at the last moment, but Mark did not let it do so. And with this, Mark successfully secured a potentially valuable ability. After seeing the things that it could do, there was no way that Mark would let it go away. While Mark hovered in the air, holding his bounty, May and Barak returned in a rush, pulling his attention. "You two okay?" Mark asked. What he did was nearly a suicide attack. With that explosion of extremely compressed air, it was no surprise that May and Barak got blown away. On the other hand, Barak gawked at Mark's words. No matter how anyone saw this situation, it should be Mark who should receive such a question. Mark's body was blood-covered, his clothes were almost ripped to shreds revealing wounds on his skin, and his right arm barely had any skin left. And yet, he was the one who had the gall to ask if they were okay. If not for the fact that he was afraid of Mark, he would not hesitate to ask the question back. May, on the other hand, approached Mark without disregard for his appearance. If not for Mark stopping her, she might have gone and embraced him. She was really worried when Mark just went and dived into the infected's body without saying anything. And now, although Mark would not seem to feel the pain in his current state, May would. Mark could only bitterly smile as he saw her expression. But it could not be helped. This much injury was worth the sacrifice, not to mention that it would heal immediately. The only actual damage done to him was his clothes. In fact, his body already started healing. Barak's eyes widened as he saw Mark's skin started to slowly return. With that inhuman healing speed, no wonder he did not mind getting such a catastrophic injury. But still, why would Mark go so far, even injuring himself to such extent? Mark glanced a bit at Barak and shrugged. From the psi crystal that was now fully exposed at the back of his wrist, an empty physical crystal flew out. The crystal then floated in front of the forehead of the decapitated head that Mark was holding. And with a few minutes of silence and Barak gawking at the spectacle, the crystal finished its work with a flash of blinding light. Mark then tossed the head away like he was throwing away garbage. What? Barak wanted to ask. As a practitioner of magic, this kind of thing interested him a lot. But of course, he could not openly ask Mark. Although he still managed to hold his curiosity inside. Instead, he focused on returning his other summons, only leaving Trua, who he was using as a mount. Despite the questions, there was no doubt that the battle here had already ended. There might still be a whole lot of infected underwater. But without the leader type, and the magical energy in this place to attract them, the threat they could give was way lower. It was unless the people in the settlement were stupid enough to do something to lure the infected back to shore. In that case, however, it was not their business any longer. There might also be the remaining part of the leader type that was still underwater. However, while the infected that became part of it were freed from the controls, they were still stuck together. Those infected could only wait until they were helplessly eaten by evolved fishes of the Gulf. "Let's go," Mark said, which became the signal for them to return. Leaving the scene of the battle, Mark's group flew away. As they did, the waves started to calm down, and the clouds began to dissipate. ******************************** Day 147 to 9:19 p.m. Port area, Catanduanes Settlement, Codon, San Andres, Catanduanes. The port had gone silent. Everyone saw that the greatest threat was gone. Surely, they were supposed to cheer in glee. However, the things that happened were just too surreal that it was hard for them to take in immediately. They all knew that they should be happy. However, what was with the complex feeling that was boiling in their hearts and minds? General, did he just? Andrew, whose eyes were better than most people here, could not believe what he had just witnessed. He clearly saw that it was Mark who finished off that huge thing. As the thought sunk into his mind, he could not help but gulp. That person that destroyed that amalgamation was the very same person he tried to subdue this morning. He could not help but feel lucky that he was stopped by other soldiers. If not, who knew how he would have died? Although there was the event this afternoon, the impact was lesser than what they witnessed just now. On the other hand, General Padilla was frowning. No wonder now that the letter he received from General Faustino said to never try to provoke Mark and his group. Those beams of light, that eerie formation of clouds, and that unknown force that destroyed the majority of the monster's body. Aside from those, there were also the girls that showed their prowess this afternoon. Not to mention that the man called Barak was now with their group. A power like that, even the whole settlement might not be able to handle their wrath. Peering at the sky with his night vision binoculars, the general's eyes followed Mark's group that was already flying away from the scene of the battle. And there, he started to move. "General, where are you going?" Andrew asked. That was also the question in the minds of all the other soldiers around them. General Padilla stopped and looked back. "To convey our gratitude for their help. Andrew, keep an eye on the direction they are flying to. We are going to meet them." The general replied before he continued to leave. Since the general left before he could reply, Andrew could only stare at the general's back. Nonetheless, he still followed the orders and carefully watched Mark's group as they flew. Asterisk asterisk. Just what in the world are those people? A playful voice could be heard inside the forest not far from the port area. There, several shadows were lurking, watching the battle against the amalgamation after the infected retreated from the settlement. Among them was no other than the man that was talking with Vanessa. "Hey Roach, are you listening?" The playful voice pestered. "Vanessa tasked you into tailing them, right? You should have some information." Annoyed, the man called Roach replied, "There's barely a day that I've been observing them. What do you expect me to know?" With that, the playful guy finally shut up. On the other hand, a calm-sounding voice asked a question to Roach instead. "Do you think we can recruit them to the organization?" "I don't know about that. We still don't know their intentions." Roach replied, "I'm not asking about them." The calm voice added, "I'm asking about your opinion." Roach looked at the man that asked that question, then shook his head. "I don't think so. Being a member of the organization is being under it. However, that guy called Mark. Rather than someone serving, it felt more like he is someone to be served. Someone who is born to be a leader, is it?" the calm man deduced. No, unexpectedly, Roach disagreed. Not a leader. That Mark could be at the border of being a tyrant. It doesn't matter if he's a leader or a tyrant, and this point the last member of the group chimed in. "Just don't unnecessarily provoke them. We are just here to observe things." To those words, everyone agreed. As their business here was also done, they all vanished into the shadows, returning to their posts. Unexpectedly, one of them, the playful one, returned to an unexpected place. It was towards the southwest direction, outside the settlement. Asterisk 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 at the sky, Mark, May, and Barak flew over the settlement once to see the situation. Seeing that most of the commotion had settled down, Barak could finally breathe in relief as they flew away. "Gerger, is that really good?" May asked, looking at Mark that was still holding the new crystal he acquired. "Very likely." Mark smiled. "Do you know why?" "Of course." May shook her head. She would not ask that question if she knew. "Remember Ilona?" Mark asked. May nodded. Of course, there was no way May would forget the most unique girl in the base. Her eaten arm was replaced by Mark, after all. Back then, we managed to create a new arm for her with Miracle's help. But we can't do that anymore, right? That was right. Although they managed to do that once, it did not mean that they could do it again in the future. Of course, it was not because Miracle's ability changed or anything. It was because the arm was created with the help of Aphelia, who was inside Miracle's body at that time. Just Miracle alone would not be able to properly create a similar thing, especially since she was a child that lacked knowledge. In the future, there was a possibility, but definitely not too soon. If I'm correct, this ability's potential did not lay on fusing bodies. Mark said, raising the crystal, and with that, the idea dawned on May. Is it a similar ability to Miracle? May asked. Not exactly. Mark shook his head. Miracle's body is made of flesh like blood, so it's not similar. Remember how the flesh membrane of the leader type looked like? It's like a roughly created muscle tissue. What if we give this ability to someone with proper knowledge? Maybe we will someone that could deal with threatening injuries at the base. May finally understood why Mark would go so far for this ability. If he was really right, then injuries that could not be healed with regeneration medicine would have a remedy now. Missing tissues could be replaced, and very deep wounds could be patched. It would be a good thing for the base as a whole. The only question now was who would they give the ability to. So far, they only had one doctor in the base. It was Philip, the old medical instructor from Perpetual Help University. Unfortunately, they did not know if he had expertise in muscles and skin. While talking about the crystal, they closed into the southwest area outside the Katandwanas settlement. Sure enough, while the presence of the little girls and the other members of their group, there were other people. Unexpectedly, though, it was just a few with about 15 people. For sure, as these people were captured, they were from the rebels. But by their number, they must be a scouting group to check the situation of the settlement before attacking. In fact, Mark could sense another larger group from quite far away. The second group seemed to be waiting for something, possibly the signal from the first group. Still, that was not where Mark's attention was focused. It was at the captured group. In fact, in Mark's eyes, there was a little bit of genuine surprise. Day 147 to 9:25 p.m. Southeast Catanduanes Settlement, Codon, San Andres, Catanduanes. Mark and May's return were happily welcomed by the girls like usual. Only this time, there were no hugs or head pats since Mark's body was covered with blood. "Welcome back, smelly scary uncle," Emika greeted while giggling. It was clear what she was going at. She mostly called Mark either scary uncle or smelly uncle depending on the conversation and mood. This time, however, the blood-soaked Mark was both. "You want a hug?" Mark asked as he opened his arms and faked to run towards the green-haired girl. Eek! Emika could not help but retreat in panic. But then, Mark started to run towards her. "Come on, don't be shy." No. She started to run away. With Mark's expression, there was no way to tell whether he was joking or not. The others could only sigh while Barak could only gawk. He was not prepared to see this playful behavior of Mark towards Emika. Of course, Mark did not really go and hug Emika. There would be various implications if he did that. Not only Emika would get dirtier, but she might annoyingly ask Mark for hugs later on. Something else? Of course not. Just whose mind was too dirty to think of that? Still, Emika was definitely scared that Mark might actually do it. Leaving the jokes aside, Mark turned to Edsel and Pefile. "They really came, don't they? Are they scouts?" Mark asked before turning his head towards the unconscious people lying around tied with ropes. "Rather than scouts, they might be an advance party," Pefile replied. "Why did you say so?" Mark asked. "Scouts should only be in the vanguard to look for enemies and note their positions. As for these people, they were preparing to ambush the soldiers on the walls before we caught them." Pefile then pointed at the weapons the captured people had on the other side. "Look." Since Mark did not pay attention earlier, he did not notice the weapons that Pefile hid on the other side. Looking at those, Pefile was definitely right. There were the M16 rifles that were commonly used by both military and the rebels. However, there were also sniper rifles and even 2 M60s. Although snipers might be, the last kind was definitely not equipment for scouts. It was quite strange. Why would the rebels send a small party to ambush the soldiers while having a much larger one on standby? It was just suicide. Or maybe, that was the goal. Unfortunately, there were a lot of things that they did not know to draw a concrete answer to the situation. In any case, with those thoughts in mind, Mark approached one of the unconscious men and sighed in front of him. "Just what are you doing here anyway?" That gesture made everyone confused. "Gerger, you know him?" May could not help but ask. "I sure do. This guy is my younger brother, after all." That came as a surprise. Why? Mark did not have a single resemblance to the guy at all. Mark had a regular, below-average appearance. The shape of his face was oval, complementing his above-average height. The unconscious man, on the other hand, had a small face. It was even though he was just a bit shorter than Mark. And more than that, this guy actually was above average in terms of looks. "I know what you all are thinking. We don't look like brothers, even a little. I have 3 siblings, and none of us look like we are related to each other. My youngest brother might have the same eye shape as me, but it was also mirrored." "Is this the hunch you had before?" Pefile asked. After all, they had never heard Mark tell them to capture people instead of obliterating them in one go. "Well, I guess you all already noticed that I'm looking for something in this place. That's my family. But as you all can see, they're not in the settlement." They all went silent. Barak aside, everyone noticed Mark looking around while in the settlement. Of course, it was not in a tourist-like way at all. even though he appeared to look like sightseeing. "Then, boss, your family is with the rebels?" Edsel asked. It was somehow unexpected. "It's not really surprising." Mark shrugged, looking back at his brother. "Why is that?" Pephile asked. "One of my close uncles, the husband of my mother's younger sister. He had quite a position there. I just don't know which faction he belonged to, right now." Mark just dropped another bomb there. While Mark was working together with the military, he actually had a direct relationship with the rebels. What a surprising contrast. The group thought that Mark's family were seeking refuge there or joined for some reason. But it was actually none of those two at all. Was that why his brother with the attackers? But before anyone could ask, Mark already spoke. "It's surprising, though. I don't think my overprotective parents will allow my brother to participate in these kinds of dangerous things. My uncle is more or less a boastful but peaceful one. I don't think he will join the aggressive faction of the rebels, either." Listening to Mark, there was one thing that everyone understood. There was something odd that was happening involving his family. "What are we going to do next, boss? Are we going to meet them?" Edsel asked immediately. Things about family were a sensitive topic to Edsel, considering his circumstances. As a person that lost his mother when he was young, he knew the feeling of losing a family member. If Mark's family were still alive, he wanted them to reunite. Amihan was the same, looking at Mark eagerly, but then, confusion took over. "Who?" Mark asked. "Your family, of course," Pephile interjected. "What are you talking about?" Mark replied. "Huh. Of course, they were surprised. Aside from May and the little girls, no one here knew about Mark's relationship with his family. I'm just going to see them but not meet them," Mark added. "My family relationship is an oddly undesirable one, you all see. Or else, why would you guys think that I'm somewhere else while all my family members are here?" The atmosphere had become odd. No one knew what to be said next. It was the first time the group learned that Mark also had family circumstances he was hiding. "So, you're not going to bring them back to the base?" Pephile asked. "No," Mark shook his head. "I only came here to check on them. The most that I can do is to make their environment safer and help them in the shadows. I did not even have a tiny bit plan of meeting them." Everyone fell silent. Although some of them still had questions, they respected Mark's decision. "But Gerger, what are we going to do with your brother?" May asked. At that question, Mark turned his eyes to Pephile, Amika, Edsel, and Pearl. "How did you knock them all unconscious?" Then, the three turned their heads at Pephile. "I used some sleeping powder." Pephile took out a satchel made of animal fur. "Our kind would use this powder on humans whenever they got lost inside our forest, then bring them out." "Does it have side effects?" Mark asked. "Just a minor one," Pephile replied. "Those made to fall asleep with this powder will forget everything that happened about an hour before they fell asleep. It's not an intended side effect when it was created, but it was convenient since the people that entered our forest will forget things that they saw inside. You know what will happen if magical things they saw got leaked out to the mortal world." That was sound reasoning. It seemed that the first person that created the powder only wanted a sleeping powder. But then, the side effect came in a convenient form. "Can I have some of that?" Mark suddenly asked. "I don't mind." Pephile replied, throwing the satchel at Mark. "You won't ask me what I'm going to use this for?" Mark asked another question as he caught the satchel. "I'm not stupid. It's obvious what you are going to do with that." Pephile replied with a scornful eye, making Mark shrug. "Let's move these people somewhere else," Mark said. "But first, let's deal with our visitors." The visitors that Mark was talking about arrived a few minutes later while they were loading the unconscious rebels on Schaffler's back. It was no other than General Padilla and his entourage. Of course, the sight of the dragon terrified the soldiers more than the fact that they were loading unconscious people on its back. Nevertheless, they were not that surprised. Barak's existence definitely became a good excuse at this time. At this point, it seemed that only the general and his secretary that checked the letter knew that Schaffler was Mark's pet from the Infanta settlement. "So, what do you all want this time?" Mark asked. Of course, he already knew what they were here for. However, he still asked. The appearance Mark had this time definitely surprised the soldiers. But considering the fight earlier, this might have been the result. It was surprising, though, that while his clothes were tattered and covered in blood, there were no visible injuries on his body. The one that was surprised the most, however, was Andrew. He definitely saw Mark heavily injured, with his arm's skin being peeled off. And yet, what was this? It was the same for General Padilla that received Andrew's report about what he saw. The general could only turn to Andrew in askance. The latter nodded, affirming that something was odd. What made them even more confused as they were sure that the regeneration medicine could not heal such heavy injury that fast. However, they could only stay silent about that topic. To Mark's question, General Padilla replied, "We came here to convey our gratitude." Then, soldiers saluted. "On behalf of the soldiers and the people in the settlement, thank you. If not for your help, who knows what would have happened to the settlement later on. If there is something you need, we'll try our best if we are capable of doing it." Hearing that, Mark smiled. Although he understood that the general was trying to get on his good side, the last sentence was more than enough to make up for it. "Then, I actually need a few things," Mark replied unceremoniously. That caused some murmurs among the soldiers. "Don't worry, I won't take advantage of all of you," Mark added as he turned to the general. "How are those 2 soldiers that were transported back this morning?" "They are still in detention," the general replied. "It's already judged that they did nothing wrong, however. They will be released tomorrow morning and get reinstated to new posts." "Is there something wrong with them?" "There's no need to reinstate them. Bring them to me tomorrow. I'll meet them at the West Gate." "What are you going to do with them?" the general asked. "Don't worry. I already had a talk with those 2. They're joining our group." Mark's words came as a surprise to the soldiers. The shock aside, there was also a tint of envy. Just what did those 2 soldiers do to be invited to Mark's group? If they already consented to it, then there's nothing we can do. I'm not going to force everyone to stay as a soldier if they already wanted to leave. The general replied with a sigh. It was a rather undesirable thing to lose some promising soldiers. Unfortunately, it seemed that the harsh treatment that the captain had given the 2 forced them to quit. "Another thing," Mark then said. "Can I have every information you have about the rebels? Including confidential ones?" That request came out of nowhere. Why would you want something like that? Of course, the general would ask. After all, there was supposed to be no relation between Mark and the rebels at this point. Mark then pointed at the people they were loading at Schaffler's back. "These guys are members of the rebels. Though as it appeared, they were forced into a suicide mission. I happen to know one of them, so I want to know the actual situation there." Learning about that, the general frowned. It looked like that the rebels did try to attack, but Mark's group intercepted them, fortunately. But then, he took notice of Mark's words. These few men were forced to do a suicide attack. There was no way that these few men would be able to do much damage to the settlement. It meant that there could be hidden circumstances. As such, General Padilla nodded at the request. If Mark could clear the rebel problem on this island, then it would be very advantageous to the settlement. Day 147 to 10:21 p.m. San Pedro Poblacion, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. A middle-sized settlement surrounded by farm fields, that was the town of San Pedro. Back then, it was a location centered on agriculture and a place where the municipal hall of Viga, Catanduanes, was located. It was located in the middle of the flatlands and was a central location between 3 more towns, and to say, it was a place filled with potential to be dug up. Now, however, this place was a location that most unaffiliated people would not dare go to. Unaffiliated to who? Of course, the aggressive faction of the rebels. Being in the middle of the flat farming fields served as an advantage for the rebels. It was a strategic place that was hard to infiltrate without getting spotted. As such, the aggressive faction took the opportunity to secure this place, turning it into their own fortress. And to say, The aggressive faction did not dilly-dally on developing this area. From walls to new buildings and training facilities, this place was packed. Although its development was slower due to lack of heavy equipment, it was not lagging behind. It might even have the most changes compared to the Kodan after the outbreak started. Unfortunately, unlike the Katandwanas settlement that was built by combined efforts, this one was by sheer forced labor. Almost all the previous residents of San Pedro, no, it could be even the majority of Viga, had fallen into the hands of the rebels. Capable men were trained and drafted to the ranks of the rebels, while women and children were put to other necessary things like agriculture and crafts. As for the rest, they were the ones that were made to build the current state of the town. But of course, not everyone would dare try to join their ranks voluntarily. Thus, those people had some of their family members held by the rebels for assurance, especially for the most capable people. For the majority, though, they had no choice but to obey. It was not like the survivors could go somewhere else. In this place, only the fortress the rebels own was the safest place. Leaving and venturing to the mountains was suicide. It was the same for living outside. The only good thing, however, the rebels had some line drawn that they were not crossing. The NPA wanted a change of governance. They were not bandits. As such, they had their own laws to be obeyed. As such, no women were forced to give their bodies to the rebels. Nevertheless, it was another thing if the women decided to sell themselves for extra food and supplies. Of course, there were some bandit-minded people among the rebels. However, those that broke the laws were subjected to inhumane punishment. Once, there was a member that molested a child, and then ended up killing the poor girl in the process. Unfortunately for the guy, he was caught while trying to dispose of the body. The perpetrator was then hanged naked in the central plaza to be an example for everyone. His confessed deed was posted on a sign with a small rack containing a stingray tail. Anyone was free to pick up that stingray tail to whip the criminal. And, of course, the criminal died in that event. That was why no one would dare break the laws at present. Why was that? Well, it was because the leader of the aggressive faction was also a woman. That was why. But of course, being a woman, she did not hold the authority over the whole faction. And that was why, even though the leader seemed to be a decent person herself, a suicide attack was conducted. The culprit for that was no other than the in charge of their military forces. He was called Lorenzo Esperanza, going by the alias Renz. Renz heard about what was happening at the settlement and sent some strike forces over. In fact, he had been waiting for this chance for a long time. He already deployed his army in advance and could be moved at a moment's notice. That was why the soldiers of the rebels arrived too early during the attack at the Katandwanas settlement. If they had to deploy their forces from the base, it might take a half day to traverse the road, after all. And now, Renz was spending time with his women, waiting for the good news to arrive. While the giggles and moans of pleasure could be heard from his quarters, the messenger finally arrived. "Sir." A message from the field had arrived. The messenger knocked on the door, reporting at the same time. "Come in." Renz's voice was heard. The messenger came in, only to see that Renz was still in the middle of playing with two women, unashamed that one of his men could see them. Fortunately, it seemed that the messenger was already used to this scene and could keep his composure. He could only sigh inside as he stared at the middle-aged man playing with 2 decades younger girls. "How is it? Did the government settlement fall already?" Renz asked, confident at the fall of the settlement. He already heard that the situation was not good at the infected side. The soldiers of the government were having a hard time defending their walls and port. If their plan to attack succeeded, the government settlement would be destroyed. Even if it did not fall, it would be severely damaged. Their plan was to send an assault party to ambush the walls. Of course, it was a suicide since it was only a small number of people. But that was the point. When the soldiers thought they won after killing the assault party, the actual ambush would finally start. It would send the government forces in disarray, without a doubt. "Yes, Sir Renz." The messenger stuttered as his attention was now back to the report. The attack had not begun. "What?" Renz stopped humping in utter surprise. What time is it already? Why haven't they started? Wait, sir. The messenger hurriedly said. They already sent the assault party. But. But what? Renz roared. The assault party strangely vanished after entering the forest near the government settlement. The messenger explained. Renz could not help but frown. He turned to the two girls lying on his bed. You two, get out. Without saying anything, the two girls grabbed their scattered clothes and scurried out of the room, naked. Renz donned his clothes, and it seemed that he was going to take things seriously now. We are going to the comms center. Tell me what happened along the way. Renz said as he went out of his room, followed by the messenger. Actually, sir, there's nothing much to report, the messenger said. Aside from a few noises from the forest, no one noticed anything else. There was no battle that happened either along the walls. So, are you saying that they vanished just like that? Renz asked, making the messenger fall silent. With a frown, Renz asked the messenger another question. What is the possibility of them escaping or turning over to the military? Very low, sir. The messenger thought about the answer for a second before replying. The members of the assault party consisted of people who had relatives under our custody. We also handpicked those that seemed to have stronger bonds to ensure that they will not mess things up. That was how the assault party, which was obviously a suicide mission, was created. The members could not decline, escape, or betray them. If they did, their loved ones would be implicated. Then, the assault party vanishing like that was definitely an odd situation. Renz and the messenger made their way towards the comms center of the base. The place where communications between the deployed armed squads were centralized. Opening the door, however, Renz could only frown. You are finally here, Renz. A woman was already waiting inside. What is this assault party I'm hearing about? The atmosphere inside the comms center was quite cold. It was clear that it was because of this woman. This woman, without a doubt, was the leader of this faction, Emmeline Aguilera. She was a woman in her early 30s with a strict-looking face. Just a stare from her fierce eyes could shake a person with a weak heart. Being started by those questioning eyes made Renz feel unpleasant. However, being an older man with a trained body, Renz would not back down from such a stare. A plan I made to ensure success in our attack at the settlement, Renz replied, staring straight at Emmeline's eyes. This time, the settlement is under attack by the infected. It is the perfect opportunity to deploy such PLAURK. Renz was not able to finish his explanation. It was because, by the time he knew, his neck was already grasped tightly by Emmeline's cold right hand. More than just a woman with stature, she was also an evolver, and a level 3 mutator. That was why, even though she had lesser influence over the rebels, no one would try to confront her face to face. It was especially because of her hot temper in contrast to her cold abilities. Calling it an assault party like an icing in a cake even though you just pushed them to suicide. I already told you, Renz. I don't want unnecessary deaths in our camp. Our goal is to overturn the government, not to dispose of people who would be under us after we achieve that. Emmeline's tone was extremely chilling. No, it was not just her tone. Even the surrounding temperature was decreasing. I understand. Renz tried to reply even though he was lacking air. I will recall them. But then, bam, Renz was slammed into the wall beside the door. You really think that I'm stupid? They're already missing. How the F***ck are you going to recall them? Ma'am. Please calm down. A few people started to appease the angry woman. Emmeline took a deep breath and begrudgingly released Renz, causing him to collapse to the ground and release a few loud coughs. Recall the remaining soldiers there, Emmeline ordered. As for the disappearance of the assault group, send someone to investigate it. Recall? Renz argued. The settlement is under attack at the north and west sides. It's our opportunity to take them down. You're already late. Emmeline glared. The people I planted in the settlement already sent a message. Their battle already ended. The government settlement is safe. That is why there is no point in attacking anymore. Renz was surprised as he turned to his messenger. Didn't you say that the government settlement is under threat? I did, sir. Renz could tell that his messenger was not lying. Then, as he looked at the other people in the room, their expressions showed that something odd had happened. I tell you, Emmeline spoke once more. Recall our forces that you mobilized. With that command, their cold tigress left the comms center, leaving Renz disgruntled. He was also a mutator. However, compared to Emmeline, he was weaker. That was why he could only scheme behind her. This is not over. Renz murmured as he grit his teeth. But for now, he told the people in charge of the communication to recall their soldiers. There was no point in making them attack anymore. ******************************* Day 147 to 11:26 p.m. Abandoned farmhouse, Catanduanes Circumferential Road, Codon, San Andres, Catanduanes. It should be just an abandoned house near the roadside in a small village northeast of Catanduanes settlement. Now, there seemed to be human activities at present in the middle of the night. A shadow of a huge winged lizard could be seen guarding the place, especially a small cottage where several men were tied up inside. Inside a room in the farmhouse, Michael lay down on a slightly dusty bed. Soon, he abruptly opened his eyes, remembering that they were supposed to be on the way to attack the government settlement. It was a suicide mission, but there was nothing else he could do. As he woke up abruptly and immediately sat down, he felt a little dizzy. That was when he noticed that he was in an unfamiliar environment. And at the opposite side of the room near the door, he saw a silhouette of a person. And then, while recovering from his dizziness, he heard the person spoke. "Hey, you. You're finally awake," in an odd voice. Day 147 to 11:26 p.m. Abandoned farmhouse, Catanduanes Circumferential Road, Codon, San Andres, Catanduanes. As his dizziness from his sudden actions from waking up subsided, Michael's eyes turned away from the silhouette that he could barely see in the dark. He then let out an audible sigh. "Just what's up with that greeting, big brother?" Hearing that reply made the silhouette shrug his shoulders. And then, with a flick of his hand, activating the crystal hidden inside his pocket, Mark lit up the whole room, showing himself to his younger brother. It was one of the few reasons why Mark did not want any, even a slight, contact with his family. There was a trait that was inherent to his family. It was more specific to his mother, Mark, and his siblings. And it was. They were all bad at remembering the faces of people. It did not matter even if they knew the person for a very long time. As long as there was little contact, it would be hard for them to recall the person's face. It was unless the person left a strong impression, no matter it was good or bad. Then, how could they recognize people? Except for the face, other different things could help them identify people. It could be the person's body shape, voice, clothing, movements, or even just the person's aura or by instinct. While the last two might be vague, it did help them recognize people. That was why jokes like someone covering their eyes to guess the other person would not work on them. Even if the person that covered their eyes and the person asking the question were two different people, it would not work at all. And now, it was shown here that even just Mark's silhouette allowed his younger brother to recognize him. Mark even made some effort to change his voice slightly. Actually, Mark was not any different, being uninterested towards people. He only relied on his emphatic abilities to recognize people before he gained access to his subconscious. Due to the sudden brightness, Michael could not help but cover his eyes. Nonetheless, he asked, "Are you here to bring me to the afterlife?" Mark almost stumbled from where he stood. No wonder his brother was lacking expressions. It seemed that he thought that he was already dead and Mark was here to fetch his soul. "Do I look like a grim reaper to you?" Mark asked back. "Not really," Michael replied. "But even if you're a total zombie apocalypse fan, there's no way you should have survived this ***T and make it all the way here." That was reasonable. Before the outbreak, Mark was nothing but a shut-in that lacked exercise in their knowledge. Even if he had some abilities, it was not enough to let him live this long and make it here alive. Back then, he only had emphatic abilities and his control with his adrenaline. The first one was only usable towards living people, while the other had a life-threatening side effect. Although it would allow him to live for some time, it would be extremely challenging to last any longer. That was if Mark did not have his fair share of fateful encounters, before and during the outbreak. Don't curse me dead. Mark rolled his eyes. I'm still alive and kicking, you idiot. Michael looked back at Mark as his eyes recovered and asked, So, I'm still alive? He then pinched his cheek. Ow. I guess I am, huh? Michael sighed in relief that he was still alive and not dreaming. I thought I suddenly died in that freaking suicide mission. Mark stared at his brother and his lacking expressions. It seemed that the situation was still surreal for him. This was very likely because of the effects powder that Pephile used and the fact that they could not remember things before they fell unconscious. Of course, something was surprising. The attack on the settlement did not last too long. It meant that the preparation time of the rebels was much shorter. Even so, Mark's brother still remembered being on a suicide mission. How much do you remember before passing out? Mark could not help but ask. Michael fell silent and thought about it a little. The last one was before we were about to enter the forest near the government settlement. Michael then replied. I don't really remember anything after that. Mark scratched his head. It seemed that the effect of the powder was too little on his brother. It just meant that he had to shorten his conversation even more. Well, you know that it's a suicide mission. Why the hell are you even there? Mark asked, not giving his brother any chance to ask about him instead. Michael looked at Mark, confused. He wanted to ask questions too, but his older brother was not giving him a chance at all. Nevertheless, the question he was given was rather important too. As such, he could only answer with another sigh. Who wanted to? But we can't really disobey those people, especially that man called Renz. Michael then looked down. Marion is under their custody, working in their factories. If I disobeyed the rebels and got her harmed, Mom won't forgive me, right? Those words made Mark frown. Marion was their younger sister, and by the looks of it, she was the leash that the rebels used to force his brother into dangerous stuff. Before Mark could ask the next question, Michael continued. We've been caught while hunting in the mountains about a month ago. Since then, we're living under the roof of the anti-government faction of the rebels. Mark felt a bit relieved to hear about this. As Mark asked questions to the two soldiers yesternight, he already had some information. The leader of the aggressive faction was not unreasonable, except for her extreme hate towards the government. That was why he did not have any vision about his siblings getting in harm. And probably, even if Mark did not interfere this time, this brother of his would definitely survive this suicide mission due to various factors. How about Mom and Dad? Also, Thaddy? Mark asked. They're being sheltered by the neutrals since the start of the outbreak, Michael replied. They would be fine there since Mom is a VIP there. We are also living there before we got caught by the antis. That was a surprising thing. Their mother was a VIP in the neutral faction? What do you mean by VIP? Mark, of course, asked. It's her tarot card reading. Michael shrugged. By the day, her readings are getting more and more accurate to the point that it was kind of terrifying. The neutrals are consulting Mom in order to keep the safety of their base. Then why the hell did you two got caught? Mark could not help but notice that detail. As for their mother's fortune-telling abilities rising, it was not surprising to Mark in the least. He was the same in that regard. However, his two siblings were still caught by the other faction. That. Michael sighed. It's our fault. We sneaked out to hunt. Remember Thaddy's birthday? We wanted to give the kid a surprise birthday party. It became a surprise farewell, though. If we asked Mom that time, things won't be like this. Mark clicked his tongue. Thaddy was their youngest brother and was just 8 years old. It was quite a gap considering their sister was already 23 despite her size and appearance. The little guy was a goofy one with ADHD. They probably wanted to distract him with a surprise birthday party in the apocalypse. As Mark was thinking, Michael finally found the opportunity to ask a question back. How about you, big brother? We all thought that you're already dead. Mom can't even tell anything about you with her cards. Only the death card appears over and over. What in the world happened to you?" At that question, Mark stayed silent. He did not want to answer. It was not like his answers would be remembered after this conversation. "You're being silent again. Just as you always do." Michael glared. As if everything else around you had nothing to do with you at all. Mark shrugged, not answering Michael's grumbles. Instead, he diverted the topic. "Do Mom know where you two are?" Avoiding the topic. "Are we?" Michael sighed with a frown. However, he knew that he would not be able to squeeze anything from his older sibling even if he continued. "Mom probably knew where we are. But we didn't let the aunties find out that we are her children." Mark nodded to that. If enemies knew that Michael and Marion were their mother's children, they could be used to blackmail the neutral faction of the rebels. It was quite a smart move, albeit being a dangerous one. After all, Michael's safety was put into jeopardy. If the aggressive faction knew about it, both Michael and Marion would be safely secured for future cooperation. In any case, both situations had good and bad sides. "I want to ask." Mark decided to ask a question that was bugging him. Why is everyone with the rebels instead of the military settlement? Is it because of Uncle Bert? That question was bugging Mark since he noticed that his family was not in the military settlement. Even if their uncle had ties with the rebels, it was more rational to evacuate to the military in these kinds of emergencies. "You think we didn't?" Michael's eyes turned furious. "During the evacuation, the leader of the soldiers took a fancy at our sister, you know that? When he tried to hit on her and got rejected, he threw us out. We had no choice but to accept Uncle Bert's invitation. We are glad we had that option at that time, or we might have ended up like the others that did not make it to the evacuation." Mark frowned. Hearing that, it looked like he needed someone else to die later. At this point, Mark already got the answers to the things he wanted to know. As such, he prepared to move out. "Where are you going?" Michael asked. "Leaving. Don't worry, I will drop you back at the neutral faction." Mark replied, looking at Michelle over his shoulder. "I can't," Michael yelled. "Marion's still at the auntie's base. Don't worry about her. I'll fetch her later. In any case, all the people with you that were sent on the suicide mission vanished during the mission. It's not wrong to say that those guys proclaimed you dead or missing. Returning will only make our sister's situation worse." Mark replied. Michael was at a loss. Nevertheless, he could tell that Mark was not joking that he was going to take their sister out of that place. But then, Michael voiced out the last question, "Don't you have any intention of joining us?" And to that question, Mark did not reply and went out of the room. "I guess not." Michael sighed. "It can't be helped, I guess." And at this time, the wind blew inside the enclosed room. As the glittering powder fell onto Michael and vanished, so is his consciousness. ***. Done. As Mark went out of the room, Paphile's voice echoed. Mark did not reply and just threw the satchel on his hand back to its owner. "You seem to be in a bad mood." Paphile asked another question. "Not exactly," Mark replied. "I'm just thinking of something else." Mark then turned to Paphile. "By the way, your powder did not work that effectively on my brother." "Is that so?" Paphile said, shaking his satchel and sniffing it a bit. "I don't think that the efficacy was reduced. It's probably because your brother is not normal, pretty much like you." That was probably right. Who else could Mark get his bloodline as a blood demon? Then, his siblings might be the same, albeit the purity was different. Then, what are we going to do with these guys? Paphile asked another question. However, he was not talking about the other rebels they caught. Instead, he pointed at the 5 little people that Paphile caught while Mark spoke with his brother. Day 147 to 11:36 p.m. Abandoned Farm, Catanduanes Circumferential Road, Codon, San Andres, Catanduanes. Mark stared at the 5 little people shivering behind Paphile. With little people was said, one would immediately think of the well-known Nuno sa Punso in Philippine myths and legends. However, The little people here were definitely not those old-looking mischievous dwarves on mounds. They were described as little, since they all appeared to be children about 3 to 6 years old. However, it was not wrong to say that they were all adults with childish appearance. They wore clothes that did not look different from humans. But at a closer look, the materials their clothing was made of were something that humans did not have. And the most noticeable thing about these little people was their unnatural black color. Their skin was pitch black, making it hard to see their facial features. Even their teeth and nails were the same, leaving their eyes as the only white thing on their bodies. The little people shivered even more at Mark's stare. It seemed that these creatures were aware of how frightening Mark was, not just as a demon but as an individual. Not to mention that Pephile was also here that had unnatural pure energy of his race. As lower beings, these little people were naturally afraid of higher ones like Pephile and Mark. "Are you 5 the ones protecting my brother in secret?" Mark asked, making the little people stare fixedly at him, and to say, it seemed that they were shocked. The 5's reaction was quite amusing. Despite the fear, the little people moved into a circle. Pephile and Mark could hear them talking in an incomprehensible language. Furthermore, aside from their high-pitched voices, they spoke too fast. The two felt like they were listening to a recorded narration being fast-forwarded. Mark waited for the 5 to finish their discussion with interest. It seemed that these creatures did not only look like children but also behaved likewise. After all, only children would do something like an emergency meeting in front of others while their voices could be clearly heard in the surroundings. Of course, it was not like anyone could understand them. Even Pephile, who was also of an elemental race, could not. "You can't understand them?" Mark asked Pephile, who seemed to be in confusion as he listened to the 5. And in response to the question, the Tamawo shook his head. "What are these people, anyway?" Unexpectedly, even Pephile could not recognize what race these 5 belonged to. Pephile was not the only one. Mark was the same in this regard. There were many mythological creatures in the Philippines that could be found in written documents and the internet. However, nothing that he had seen before accurately portrayed these 5's appearance. Nonetheless, Mark was not ignorant of the existence of these creatures. How? Considering how Mark had a family with unnatural characteristics, they were not new to the paranormal. Even Mark grew up with experience and interest in these kinds of things. And most of these characteristics originated from his mother's family. There were a lot of stories that he heard from his mother when he was younger. Some were weird, and some were interesting. All of them, however, was about the unknown. One short story revolved around the day his mother was going home alone from the church when she was young. And for some reason, while she was walking home after the mass finished, there was nothing but children walking along the road, the same way she was going. And those children had the very same characteristics as the small people in front of them now. His mother was confused, hearing the children with odd appearances talking in a language she could not understand. And then, one suddenly spoke to her in the same way. As she stared in confusion, the child that talked to her was the same. The latter realized that his mother was not the same as them. And as if the scene had shifted, everything around her blurred before returning to normal. Yes, normal. It was the very same road, but the black-skinned children were nowhere to be seen. Instead, there were the people that were going home from the church all around her. That was one of the unforgettable experiences that their mother shared with them when they were little. Considering how his mother described the creatures, Mark had searched for them on the internet before. However, nothing came up in his search. While it was strange, it was also possible that this race of elementals was rare or only present in Catanduanes, causing the lack of its presence. And by their disposition, they were a shy race that would not show themselves to humans if possible. And now, the very same kind of creatures was present, protecting his brother in secret. It would not be surprising if even his sister had the same bodyguards in the shadows. After the 5 talked, one timidly stepped forward, looking at Mark. It was a boy who seemed to be the oldest among the 5. "AIA not section IA not IAIAIA section, IAIAIAIA not section IAIAIAIA section?" A not section a section I. The boy spoke. Yep, I can't understand you, Mark shrugged. It seemed that while they were at least capable of understanding human language, they could not speak it. Not only that it was comprehensible, but it also finished over a dozen syllables in 2 seconds. Even the most popular rappers would shrink on how fast these little people spoke. Can you speak Filipino? Human language? Mark asked. Even if he could tell that this guy was asking a question, there was no way he would be able to answer without understanding what it was. A not I section, I. The boy replied, tilting his head shyly. Mark sighed. This would go nowhere. Furthermore, it seemed that the issue was not because these little guys could not speak human language. It was more like their physiology did not allow them to. It was like when Pephile introduced himself for the first time. Pephile was not his exact name at all but an alias that he used. It was because his real name could not be pronounced in human language. Mark sighed. He was interested in these little people, but he would not waste time deciphering their language. As such, Mark could only turn to Pephile. Does that powder work on other elementals? Understanding what Mark wanted to do, Pephile replied. It depends. It won't work on elementals without bodies, after all. I think it will work fine on these people. Then use it on them. We'll send these 5 back together. Of course, the 5 little people became scared as the oldest one tried to step back. However, while they might be able to protect Michael from harm and other humans, there was no way that they would be able to do anything to Mark and Pephile. As such, the glittering powder was thrown onto them, causing the 5 to collapse. Mark poked the cheek of one of the 5 little people, confirming that the powder worked. I really did work. I thought it's only for humans at first. It's made with plants from our forest. Of course, it had magical properties that can also affect other elementals and spirits as long as they had a body. Pephile proudly declared. Still, you decisively took action on these guys, huh? Aren't you interested? I am interested. However, there's no time to spare, and since we don't know why these 5 were protecting my brother, it's better if they knew nothing about our interference. Mark replied, on which Pephile nodded. Then, they loaded the people, both the forced members of the rebels and the 5 little people, on Schaffler's back. Securing them with blood metal chains and fixes, Mark made sure that none of them would fall off. Well, some of them would get bruised by this, but it was better than dying. Pephile, you go back to camp. I'll throw these guys near the neutral encampment. Mark said to Pephile as he brought out his wings. If you say so, Pephile replied. Just be back soon. Mark nodded as he and Schaffler took flight in the darkness of the night. Since the effects of the powder would only take a few hours before they wake up, there was no time to waste. Schaffler carefully flew while following behind Mark. Their destination was the northernmost part of Catanduanes, the municipality of Pandan. Mark learned it from the 2 young soldiers last night. The neutrals occupied the northernmost areas of the island. It was the same for the faction that wanted to make peace with the military. Why was that? It was because the aggressive faction prevented the other 2 camps from setting up near the military settlement. The reason was not surprising. The Antis wanted to stop the other 2 from joining forces with the military. In fact, some clashes happened between the factions before because some tried to move out. All of them were members of the rebels. There was no way that the aggressive faction would let their members join their enemies even if it caused infighting. And as such, to avoid more unnecessary bloodshed, the other 2 factions stayed put to where they were currently. Of course, it was not like they did not want to resist. However, compared to the members of the 2 factions combined, the aggressive faction had more manpower and firepower. There was nothing they could do if they wanted to survive. Luckily, the leader of the aggressive faction was not unreasonable. They just had to stay put and nothing would happen. Their enemies were the government and its soldiers and not their own people. This made the bases of the other 2 factions hard to reach. After all, They were located on the opposite side of the island, furthest from the military settlement. Although there was a road that connected both ends of the island that passed through the island's coastline, it was still a dangerous endeavor. Even Mark and Chafflar's journey over the mountains was not safe at all. Chafflar was large. Although its black-colored scales hid it in the night, it still did not escape the eyes of more sensitive creatures. Because of that, Mark had to defend Chafflar from enemies. Giant insects like arm-sized mosquitoes and moths that were as large as a small mountain bike, and even a single literal firefly. Each was dangerous in their own ways. The mosquitoes were not large enough and were hard to hit, not to mention that they flew too fast. The moths had numbing powders scattering everywhere from their wings. Lastly, the firefly actually shot fire from its anus. It was quite dangerous since the mountain was covered with trees. Even Mark was caught off guard and was almost singed by the fist-sized fireball. And looking at the German shepherd-sized firefly, its thorax was literally burning. Even after Mark killed it, the thorax was still ignited inside and continued to burn. And as such, Mark stored the corpses of the insects after killing them. He would not pass up the opportunity for such rare materials. The proboscis of the mosquitoes alone could be used for many things. For example, needles or hidden weapons. After all, it was almost as strong as metal. As for the numbing powder from the moths, there was no need to ask what it could be used. And lastly, the burning thorax. There were a lot of possibilities to use this. Even just as a light or fire source, it was helpful. Although it was possible that the light could go off, just the thorax alone was a good fireproof material. Mark did not expect quite a harvest, although he was just bringing unconscious people back. He could not help but anticipate what kinds of other creatures he would encounter along the way. Unfortunately, aside from a few large pungent-smelling bats that even he would not try eating, he did not encounter anything interesting. Finally, Mark reached the base of the neutral faction. How was he sure? Well, he could detect his mother and father in one of the buildings together with their youngest sibling. Day 148 to 12:27 a.m. San Roque, Pandan, Catanduanes. The barangay of San Roque. It was where the neutral faction of the rebels resided. Before the outbreak, San Roque was one of the most populated barangays in Catanduanes. It was even more developed comparing other places like Codon and Viga, where the military and the Antis currently resided. Although right now, the situation was the complete opposite. At this moment, only less than a third of its previous occupants and the members of the neutral faction of the rebels lived here. During the start of the outbreak, the military came here to evacuate people. Of course, not everyone would want to leave their homes. As there was also a lack of manpower and vehicles, the soldiers could not enforce a forced evacuation. Furthermore, unlike typhoons and earthquakes, there was barely any sign that the world was ending. Many people did not believe and refused to believe. As such, a lot of people remained. Actually, it was the same for the rebels that were stationed in Catanduanes. At first, they thought that the evacuation and end of the world stuff were just government propaganda. It was until the hard truth struck everyone when evolved animals soon attacked, and everyone was unprepared. The remaining population of the barangay drastically lessened, forcing everyone to hole in their houses. It was all while the evolved animals roamed the streets. With barely any supply in hand, many more people died. It was until the neutral faction of the rebels occupied the barangay. They secured the compound of the Pandan District Hospital as their base. And now, every person living in this barangay was inside that compound. At the edge of the forest, east of the Pandan District Hospital, Mark landed with Chafflar. Since the district hospital was at the east edge of the barangay, the only things that stood between the east forest and the barangay were a wide patch of farm fields and a river. As such, the base of the neutral faction was already within Mark's detection range. As Mark picked a place with higher elevation to land, he could also see a large part of the compound. And to say, compared to the state of the military settlement, the state of the base here was disappointing. Of course, comparing the two using manpower was unreasonable. If comparing a small faction and the military, There was no doubt that the latter surpassed the former. But of course, that was not what Mark was using as a basis. It was just, the walls that surrounded the compound looked sloppy. It was tall, all right. Probably about 5 meters in height, however, everything seemed to be made of scrap. That was right, scrap. It was like those kinds of cheap walls one would see when playing zombie-base building games. The one that would make anyone question whether their base would be safe with those walls. Nevertheless, since the base was still standing strong, these walls might actually serve their purpose, in the least. However, it did not hide one fact. The neutral faction was not only undermanned but also lacked building materials to build a proper base. Even in Mark's point of view, he could see many structures that appeared like something you would see in a squatter's compound. Fortunately, as Michael mentioned earlier, their parents, specifically their mother, was held in high regard. They were currently in one of the most secure places in the compound. What surprised Mark, however, was that it was not only his family members who were here. He could also detect their other relatives. To be specific, their mother's siblings and their families. It was kind of strange for some reason. After all, from what he knew, they were all living scattered all over Katandwanas. Since the outbreak came too sudden and the military conducted an evacuation, it was almost impossible to see them all in one place. Mark could not help but think that there were other powers at play here. However, there were hidden circumstances of his family, specifically on his mother's side. As such, this situation was not impossible. And to say, it seemed that the answer was not far from Mark at all. Since they landed, Shaflar was already uneasy and was on tight guard. Why? Is there really a need for all of you to surround us? Mark spoke using the local language, Bicolano. He asked that question while panning his eyes in the surroundings. That was right. It was not only Mark, Shaflar, and the unconscious guys who were here. The moment they landed, they were slowly being surrounded. It was not like Mark cared about it, though. Nonetheless, there was something that even he did not expect. And who surrounded Mark and Shaflar? No, what should be the more appropriate question? They were already found out. As such, those that surrounded Mark and Shaflar slowly showed themselves. Some slowly emerged from behind the trees. A few actually popped out of the ground, while some appeared like ghosts. And to say, none of them were humans. There were those black-skinned children that were lurking at the side. Some were races that Mark had seen before in the spirit dimension were also present. There were also Tamawas like Pephile among the crowd. However, Mark could tell that they were not related to Pephile at all. It was because they had the different colors and styles of the tribal markings on their bodies. But the most unexpected were some creatures that looked totally out of place. An example was a lady in white, a shadowy figure wearing Western medieval armor, and even a ball of blue flames hovering in the air. Nonetheless, while they were unexpected, their existence did not surprise Mark that much. The thing that surprised him the most was the woman standing beside one of the Tamawas that seemed to have a high position in this group. Mark observed the surroundings. About 50 different creatures were surrounding him and Shaflar. And there, slowly coming into existence, a beautiful woman donned in a white dress and flower accessories appeared. There was no doubt that she was the leader of these people. Looking at the Diwata that appeared, Mark remembered one of the folklores he heard before. There was a mountain in Katandwanas that locals call Haraya, and to say, it was a mountain filled with stories of wonders. Even their closest aunt shared her own story of how she accidentally entered an unfamiliar place in the mountain which looked like a sanctuary. If such a magical sanctuary existed in the mountains, there was no doubt that it would be managed by a Diwata. Mount Banahaw was the same, after all. And now, Mark was being surrounded by that Diwata and her entourage. As the Diwata opened her eyes, the first thing she panned her eyes to were the 5 little people that were unconscious and tied on Shaflar's back. And another surprise came. She actually included Michael in her attention. "What have you done to them, demon?" the Diwata asked with hostility. That question was more than enough to make Mark realize the issue here. Most spirit and elemental races were hostile to demons. The opposite was also the same. It was not surprising that they concluded that Mark had done and planned to do some ill things as a demon. Mark looked at the Dewata straight in the eye and shrugged. Taking his eyes away from her, he approached Chaflar. The movements he made surely pushed the surroundings to be on guard. But then, Mark took off the chains that affixed the unconscious people on Chaflar's back. Mark then looked at the Dewata. If you're worried about them, then take them back. That gesture made the surroundings confused. They could not fathom what in the world was going on. The Dewata was also wary, but as Mark removed the chains, she began to move. She waved her hands like a conductor of an orchestra. And then, strong winds enveloped the surroundings before the wind focused on the 5 little people on Chaflar's back. Slowly, the 5 floated towards their companions, who eagerly received them. And then, unexpectedly, Michael was also lifted away from Chaflar's back before he was caught by the spirit wearing the medieval armor. But then, Mark spoke. Can't you take all of them? Huh? The Dewata was appalled, staring at Mark incredulously. I came here to drop them off to the people there, Mark added while pointing his thumb at the base of the neutral faction. Since you already took those, why not take them all? Sure enough, Mark's words were taken with confusion in the surroundings. Thus, Mark repeated. I just came here to return them. Can you take these other people too? The Dewata frowned. You don't have to repeat what you said using different words. I understood what you wanted to say. Then, Mark asked. Those humans are not our responsibility. The Dewata said, glancing at the other unconscious men. Mark shrugged. Sure enough, things were getting more and more interesting. I see. Mark said before panning his eyes to the surroundings once more. Every individual that his stare landed on seemed to put on their guard in one way or another. They were definitely wary of Mark. Seriously, you all don't have to be that wary, Mark said. He did not want to be in a hostile relationship with these people. After all, it was obvious that they had some connection with his family. There was no doubt about that. Then, the Dewata spoke. If you really want to just drop off those humans, leave them in the field. We will make sure that the humans in that settlement will find them. The Dewata pointed her finger at the open farmland. She surely was also not fond of humans, it seemed. After all, the farmland was filled with mud since it was used to plant rice. There was no need to explain what would happen if these people were left there. Well, Mark did not care either. As such, in his mind, he commanded Chaflar to drop the unconscious people there without hesitation. As Chaflar moved forward, the encirclement also opened. It seemed that they were really afraid of Chaflar too, considering their panic as they moved out of the way. Now, Mark was the only one left in the encirclement. Nevertheless, it was hard to say who was at the edge here. After all, the one being encircled was calm, and those surrounding him were the nervous ones. Say, I want to ask something, Mark said as his sight turned back to the Dewata. We are not answering any question from a demon, the Dewata firmly replied while frowning. Mark did not entertain her words and still asked. I understand why you took them. Mark glanced at the 5 little people. Then, why also him? Mark then glanced at Michael. The Dewata did not reply, only glaring at Mark. You're really not going to answer? This has nothing to do with you, demon. The Dewata replied with her frown deepening. I have, though. Mark tilted his head. That's my younger brother he is carrying there. Bam. The atmosphere froze. Even the Dewata's eyes turned wide. Who? The Dewata seemed to have lost her composure. Who is your younger brother? Him. Mark pointed. Michael. Mark's confirmation turned the atmosphere even more panicked. No one expected and could accept the bomb that Mark had just dropped. No, that is impossible. How can a demon like you? You must be trying to trick us. Sure enough, they would not believe Mark easily, but then, Mark decided to say something that would very likely confirm his identity. Even though I can recognize my aunt there, Mark glanced at the woman standing behind one of the Tamawas. The Dewata turned to the woman. Is what this demon said true? The woman could only shake her head. Of course, she did not recognize Mark. Don't ask her. Mark shrugged. She won't recognize me. The last time she saw me was when I was 5 when we took a vacation here. I wasn't able to go to her funeral either. Hearing those words, however, made the woman's eyes go wide. The more Mark spoke, the more his identity became credible. Day 148 to 12:39 a.m. East Area Forest Border, San Roque, Pandan, Catanduanes. In the middle of the night, a reddish-black dragon was dumping unconscious men on the mud. In the forest not far from it, a demon was surrounded by different magical races. It was quite a surreal scene, a scene that almost no human in modern times would believe. Mark shrugged at the silence that enveloped the surroundings. There were no lies in what he said. It was also true that the only time he met this aunt of his was when he was just a small boy. Nevertheless, it seemed to be hard for these races to believe him. But then, Mark's aunt stepped forward with an unsure expression. "You are Mark?" she asked. "That boy that suddenly got lost for no reason and then just appeared in front of the house after sunset?" Ah. Mark could not make a comeback to that. That event did happen. But for some reason, even in his subconscious, Mark had no recollection of what really happened that time. Still, out of all things, that was what she remembered. Well, it was no like Mark did anything remarkable to remember when they went on vacation here at that time. "That's me." Mark shrugged as he replied. Of course, as the reply started to sink in her mind, her eyes grew wide. It seemed that it was really shocking that the demon standing in front of her was the very same kid back then. On the other hand, Mark was a bit less surprised to see her here, not as a human but as a half-spirit. Jenny della Providencia, that was her maiden name. She was the third child among the 6 siblings and the third female too. Well, they were supposed to be 7, but one child was not only born odd but also died shortly after birth. She was married to a rather unfaithful man, but even so, she lived her life like normal with her children. But then, when neither her husband nor her children were at home, they came home only to find a cold corpse in the living room. And to say, while it was announced as cardiac arrest, her death was quite mysterious. Not to mention that there were rumors of her being courted by something inhuman. It was not just a rumor in the family, but it seemed that it was secretly known by the neighbors too for some reason. Furthermore, that was not the first instance. There were others way before that. In their family, Jenny was the most attractive woman. Well, towards non-human beings. It was not wrong to say, though. Among her siblings, her looks were far better. But even so, she married a human and had children. She was also faithful. It was very unlikely that she would follow her non-human suitors and leave her family. And yet, here she was, already turned into a non-human being. And why could Mark tell that she was just a half-spirit? It was because she was alive. She was not just a soul at all. It made Mark think that whatever the thing that was buried in her grave, there was no way that it was her at all. Probably it was just a trunk of a banana tree, like how the folklore went. After all, there were various stories of people being kidnapped by elementals but were proclaimed dead. It was because their bodies were found. However, that body was not a real one but just a banana trunk covered with illusion. Once the body was buried in their graves, the illusion would be dispelled. And once the family members or other people dug the grave, they would find nothing inside the casket but some dried plant matter. Jenny's death was too mysterious. After all, she had no history of having heart problems, although it was true that her body was getting weaker as time went by. That was why even though they were present at her funeral, some people believed that she was not dead and was taken away instead. And since she was present here, it seemed that it was true that she was taken away by spirits and elementals instead of dying. Jenny stared at Mark, scrutinizing his appearance. Nonetheless, she was not saying anything. She was quite a shy person. Furthermore, the strange circumstances around her fueled this trait of hers. And even though they were relatives, it was the first time she saw Mark after 24 years. Trying to confirm Mark's identity was the best she could do. Finally, after about half a minute of staring contest, Jenny opened her mouth. "You've grown big," she said. Mark could only smile bitterly. It was also true, after all. Back then, Mark was just a small child, even compared to his cousins of the same age. It was even though the shortness of stature ran strong in their family. But now, Mark was a tall man, probably taller than any of their relatives here in Katandwanas. Even Jenny standing straight was just up to his chest. That was how short she was. Jenny slowly took a step forward. After all, it had been years since she was able to talk to any of her relatives. She might be shy, but her longing for familial interaction seemed to have taken over. But of course, it would not happen just like that. Jenny could only stop as her arm was grabbed by the Tamawo that stood in front of her earlier. "Ordulk, what are you?" Jenny turned to the Tamawo only to see him shaking his head. "He might be your nephew, but don't forget that he's a demon. Those demons nearly caused you to die." Jenny could only clench her fist dejectedly. On the other hand, Mark's interest was piqued. It seemed that his aunt became a spirit, not because she wanted to. Also, by how it appeared, these spirits did not want it either. However, it seemed that they had no choice, and it was only the way for her to live. "Can you not associate me with those demons?" Mark spoke to the Tamawo called Ordulk. "What are you talking about?" Ordulk said, with hostility. "Demons are demons. All of them are the same." "Wow, what a prejudice," Mark could not help but say. Of course, those words only made Mark gain more hostility from the surroundings. It seemed that these bunch had the worst experiences with demons. "In any case, I'm not interested why you people is too hostile." Mark shrugged as he turned to his aunt. "Aunt Jenny, are you the reason why they are protecting my brother?" "No, probably the whole family, right?" Jenny immediately understood what Mark was talking about, and in response, she hurriedly shook her head. It's not me." And then, she turned to the Diwata. With that gesture, it not hard to understand. His family was actually under the protection of this Diwata. "Why?" Mark asked the Diwata. He was really curious. And there, the Diwata could only sigh. She was obviously hostile to demons. But as it was confirmed that Mark was related to Jenny and Michael, her hostility lessened drastically. "Here is not a good place to talk. Follow me," the Diwata said as she turned around, facing the deeper areas of the forest. But Diwata, of course, there would be some opposition. It was the very same Tamawo, Ordulk, that shouted. "It's fine," the Diwata said with a beautiful smile. "He might be a demon, but he's also their relative. It is not the race that matter here but our vow." With those words, Ordulk finally closed his mouth. Of course, the spirits and elementals were still looking at Mark with eyes filled with hostility. One wrong move from Mark and these guys would definitely jump for his neck. And then, the Diwata started to lead the way. It was when Mark suddenly spoke. "Wait. What is it?" The Diwata turned her head and asked. "My dragon is still dumping those guys." The Diwata froze a bit. Her mind was too preoccupied with the revelation that the demon in front of her was a relative of the people they were protecting. That was why she forgot about Chaflar that was still dumping the unconscious men in the middle of the muddy farm field. After Chaflar was finished with his task, they finally left the place. They went deeper and deeper into the forest. Mark then realized. Even though they were just walking leisurely, it seemed that they covered a very large distance already. In just a few minutes, they already reached the next mountain, even though that distance would normally take about half an hour of walk. By the looks of it, it was the very same ability they used to surround Mark and Chaflar when they landed. It was a very good ability, and what was more was that it could be used on a group of people. The journey took quite a while. Probably, about half an hour or so. Mark could not tell at all. Furthermore, even though he kept track of the direction they were taking, he had no idea where they were now. And then, as they stepped foot onto another forest at the foot of the next mountain, the surroundings changed drastically. "The domain," Mark murmured. They already entered the sanctuary the Diwata was managing. It was the home for the good spirits and elementals in Katandwanas. Still, to bring him here, it could be either the Dewata was not cautious of him anymore, or she was confident. However, it was most likely the latter. After all, it was their territory. It would be surprising if they were not confident that they could win if Mark suddenly changed his mind and attacked. And to say, even though it was not a part of the spirit dimension, there were a lot of spirits and elementals residing in this place. If Mark made a bad move, he would be swarmed by these people. The hostility aside, Mark could only admit, the place looked beautiful. The trees had lustrous green leaves that were very noticeable even in the dark. There were huge mushrooms here and there, and some were even emitting a bright glow. There were also some nighttime flowers that were emitting light like lamps. Mark kept looking around, trying to see if he could find some interesting things. As for Michael, he was still being carried by the armored spirit. Since it was troublesome for everyone present if he suddenly woke up, one of the spirits applied sleeping magic on Michael. It was really convenient. But of course, that magic was not capable of erasing memories, unlike the powder of Bephile's tribe. A few more minutes passed. They finally reached a destination. And unexpectedly, their destination was a seating area under a huge spirit tree. This tree was just a regular magical tree, though, unlike Chio, the night-evered pure spirit tree that Mark owned. In any case, this spirit tree seemed to be unique on its own. Its leaves seemed to glitter in the darkness of the night. "Take a seat," the Dewata said, pointing at a half-cut log behind a tree trunk table. At the same time, she dismissed a lot of the spirits and elementals, leaving only a few necessary ones. "Do we really have to go all the way here just to talk?" Mark asked as he took the seat. "Yes," the Dewata answered without hesitation. "The question you asked is quite a troublesome one. If some unnecessary beings caught wind of the conversation, it might put everyone in danger." Hearing that reply, Mark could only nod. It was rather obvious that she was talking about demons when she said unnecessary beings. "Then, can you already explain what was going on?" Mark urged. "You don't have to be worried. The time here is slightly slower than outside. There is no rush," the Dewata said as she called unto some people to join the conversation.